a world-shattering secret, a love that was never meant to be. When Dr. Marcus Hale and Dr. Alana Porter fell in love, they thought they had found their forever, until a shocking truth unraveled their entire existence. A DNA test, a missing child, a past neither of them could have imagined. What happens when the person you love turns out to be someone you can never have? Watch until the end to uncover this heart-wrenching mystery. Where are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories. Dr. Marcus Hale adjusted the cuffs of his crisp white coat as he stepped into the grand ballroom of the San Francisco Medical Conference. The air was thick with the low hum of murmured conversations, the occasional clink of coffee cups against fine china, and the rhythmic tapping of polished shoes against the marble floor. He had attended countless conferences over the years, each one a repetition of the last. Formal greetings, technical discussions, and a sense of detachment from anything outside of medicine. Yet today felt different, though he couldn't quite place why. He had built his career with unwavering discipline, working his way up to become one of the country's top cardiothoracic surgeons. Medicine was his world, and within it he had control. Every decision was based on logic, every outcome measured in data and precision. Personal attachments had always taken a backseat, and he had long accepted that. It wasn't until recently that he started feeling an odd void, a silent, nagging emptiness that even the most successful surgeries couldn't fill. As he moved toward the main auditorium, his sharp blue eyes flicked toward the digital screen listing the day's panels. His own presentation on advancements in minimally invasive cardiac procedures was scheduled for the afternoon. Until then, he had time to sit in on a few discussions. He chose one at random, an in-depth panel on congenital heart defects. The conference room was already half filled with professionals, some engaged in hushed discussions, others reviewing notes on their tablets. Marcus took a seat near the front, his attention drifting between the speaker preparing at the podium and the slides flickering to life on the large projection screen. Then she walked in. At first, he noticed her only in passing, a woman with deep brown skin and an air of quiet confidence. But something about her presence made him look twice. She moved with an effortless grace, her posture poised yet relaxed. Her dark curly hair was swept into a professional updo, revealing sharp cheekbones and intelligent eyes that darted swiftly across the room as she scanned the presentation materials on her tablet. There was something eerily familiar about her, though he knew they had never met before. As the discussion began, he found himself paying more attention to her than to the speaker. She wasn't just listening. She was absorbing, analyzing every word with a sharp intensity. Occasionally, she pursed her lips in thought, jotting down notes with swift precision. Then, when the panel opened for questions, she raised her hand. "Dr. Carter," she addressed the lead panelist, her voice smooth yet firm. "Your research suggests that early intervention in cases of atrial septal defect drastically improves patient outcomes. But have you considered the latest findings from the Boston study on neonatal heart adaptation? Their research implies a different approach, one that delays surgical correction in favor of pharmacological management in the first 6 months. How does your data compare?" The room fell silent for a brief moment before the panelist cleared his throat, visibly caught off guard. Marcus found himself smirking. It wasn't often that someone challenged a leading expert so directly, and she had done it with both grace and precision. He respected that. By the time the session ended, Marcus was more intrigued by her than he was by the discussion itself. As the crowd filtered out of the room, he maneuvered through the seats, closing the distance between them. "You've got a sharp mind," he said as he caught up to her. She turned to him, slightly surprised, then recognition flickered in her eyes. Dr. Marcus Hale, right? Your presentation is this afternoon." He nodded. "And you are?" "Dr. Alana Porter, cardiology." The way she said it carried a quiet confidence, an understanding of her own achievements without the need for arrogance. "That was an impressive question back there," he said. Dr. Carter, the panelist, hadn't expected the challenge, but Alana had handled it effortlessly. She laughed lightly. He should have been prepared. The Boston study is groundbreaking, but a lot of people don't want to admit it contradicts traditional surgical approaches. Marcus studied her, intrigued not only by her intellect but by the ease with which she spoke. There was no hesitation, no insecurity. She simply knew her field and wasn't afraid to challenge the norms. Their conversation flowed naturally as they walked down the hallway, moving from medical theories to personal anecdotes about the stresses of their work. Social interactions had always felt tedious to Marcus, forced, scripted, but with Alana it was different. It was effortless. The hours passed quickly, and before he knew it, his own presentation was looming. "I should go prepare," he said, glancing at his watch. Alana nodded. "I'll be in the audience. I'm curious to see what you have to say." He hadn't expected that, but he found that he liked the idea of her being there. That evening, after his presentation, they met again, this time over dinner at a quiet restaurant near the conference venue. It was the first of many such evenings. Over the next several months, their relationship deepened. They exchanged texts and phone calls late into the night, met whenever their schedules allowed, supported each other through the demands of their careers. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt something shift inside him. The emptiness that had loomed over him for years began to fade, replaced by something warm and steady. With Alana, he wasn't just Dr. Hale, the renowned surgeon. He was simply Marcus. 2 years later, he stood on a secluded beach at sunset, holding her hands in his. The waves whispered against the shore, and the golden light cast a soft glow around them. He had never been a man who believed in fate, but standing there with her, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything in his life had led him to this moment. "Marry me," he said simply. Alana didn't hesitate. Yes. With that one word, their future was set into motion. Miles away, Margaret Hale sat alone in her living room, the dim light of the evening sun casting long shadows across the wooden floor. A cup of tea rested in her trembling hands, untouched. On the coffee table before her sat a small wooden box, its edges worn with age. Inside were fragments of a life she had lost. Photographs, baby clothes, a tiny silver bracelet. She hadn't opened it in years. But tonight something stirred inside her, compelling her to face the past she had spent a lifetime trying to bury. Her fingers hovered over the lid. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, she lifted it open. The weeks following their engagement passed in a blur of hospital shifts, late-night phone calls, and stolen moments of quiet intimacy. Marcus and Alana had both built their lives around discipline and structure, but together they found something neither of them had expected: a sense of belonging, a feeling of home. Marcus had always been a man of precision. Every decision he made, whether in the operating room or in his personal life, was calculated and deliberate. But with Alana, things had been different from the start. He didn't have to think twice. She had entered his life like a force of nature, unraveling the rigid order he had wrapped himself in for years. He had thought he was content before her, but now he understood he had merely been existing. Their engagement was met with excitement from friends and colleagues, but for Marcus, the only blessing that truly mattered was his mother's. Margaret Hale had been the only constant in his life, the woman who had taken him in when no one else wanted him. She had been the one to patch up his scraped knees, push him toward his dreams, and remind him that he was more than his past. Her approval wasn't just important, it was necessary. That was why, as he and Alana drove up the quiet, tree-lined street toward his childhood home, Marcus found his fingers gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. "She's going to love you," he said, though the words felt more like a reassurance to himself than to Alana. Alana chuckled from the passenger seat, watching him with those perceptive brown eyes. "You say that like she hasn't already met me. Meeting at a restaurant isn't the same as bringing you home. Are you nervous?" she teased, tilting her head. Marcus exhaled through his nose, a half-smile tugging at his lips. "I just want everything to go perfectly." Alana reached over and squeezed his hand. "It already has." The house came into view, a modest but well-kept colonial with white shutters and a porch that had once been his favorite place to sit and read on rainy days. Margaret had always kept the yard pristine, and today was no different. Potted flowers lined the walkway, their colors vibrant against the freshly cut grass. Margaret was already at the door when they stepped out of the car. She was dressed in one of her usual cardigans, her silver-streaked hair pulled back neatly. There was warmth in her smile, but Marcus didn't miss the way her eyes lingered on Alana, as if studying her. "Come here, you," Margaret said, pulling Marcus into a firm embrace. He held her close, inhaling the familiar scent of lavender and something distinctly maternal. When she stepped back, she turned to Alana with an easy grace. "It's wonderful to see you again, dear." Alana smiled, reaching out to take Margaret's hands. "You have a beautiful home, Mrs. Hale." "Margaret, please." She squeezed Alana's fingers gently. "And thank you. It's not much, but it's been ours for a long time." Marcus led them inside, the house just as he remembered it. Cozy, filled with soft lighting and the scent of something warm baking in the oven. The dining table was already set, the plates arranged with a care that spoke of Margaret's quiet excitement. As they settled into the evening, conversation flowed easily. Margaret asked about Alana's work, her family, her upbringing. Alana spoke openly, though there was always a carefulness in the way she discussed her past. She had been adopted as a toddler, with no memory of where she came from. Margaret listened intently, her fingers resting against her teacup as Alana talked. There was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when something flickered across Margaret's face. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but Marcus noticed it. Later, when Alana excused herself to take a call, Marcus turned to his mother. "What's wrong?" Margaret hesitated, stirring her tea as if choosing her words carefully. "Nothing's wrong," she said slowly. "She's a lovely girl." "But..." Margaret met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "It's just strange. I can't explain it, but there's something familiar about her." Marcus frowned. "Familiar how?" Margaret shook her head. "It's probably nothing. I'm just being an old woman with an overactive imagination." Marcus wanted to press, but Alana returned before he could. The rest of the night went smoothly, but as Marcus and Alana left, Margaret stood at the doorway, watching them go with an unreadable expression. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Margaret sat in her living room, staring at the small wooden box on her coffee table. She hadn't opened it in years, not since she had finally forced herself to accept what she had lost. But now, something deep inside her whispered that she needed to. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the lid, revealing the faded remnants of a past that had never truly let her go. She traced the edges of an old photograph, the image of a bright-eyed little girl with a beaming smile staring back at her. Eleanor. Margaret swallowed hard, the familiar ache settling in her chest. She had spent years wondering what had happened to her, years searching, hoping, before she had finally let the grief consume her. But tonight, for the first time in decades, that hope stirred again. Because for the briefest moment, when she had looked into Alana's eyes, she had felt something impossible. Recognition. Margaret Hale lay awake long after midnight, her bedroom cloaked in silence, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Sleep refused to come, her mind tangled in memories that she had spent years trying to bury. The warmth in Alana's eyes, the familiar curve of her cheek, the soft cadence of her voice. It was impossible. It had to be. And yet, the feeling gnawed at her, a whisper of something too unsettling to ignore. She had seen it before, the birthmark. Margaret had traced it 100 times when Eleanor was a baby. A delicate crescent just beneath the curve of her left wrist. It had been unique, something no one else in their family had, and now, decades later, she had seen the exact same mark on Alana. Coincidence? Perhaps, but Margaret had never been a woman who put much stock in coincidences. At dawn, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, staring at the wooden box she had left open the night before. Faded newspaper clippings, old photographs, a tiny silver bracelet, the last remnants of a life stolen from her. Eleanor had vanished when she was just 3 years old. One moment she had been there, her tiny hand clutching Margaret's fingers as they walked through the park, and the next she was gone. No sound, no struggle, just gone. The police had searched for months. The case had been national news. A beautiful little girl with golden brown curls and eyes too wise for her age had disappeared without a trace, and no one had ever found her. No ransom demand, no body, just silence. Margaret had never stopped searching, even when the world told her to, even when her husband had begged her to move on. It had cost her everything, her marriage, her peace, her ability to live without constantly looking at passing faces, wondering. And then, eventually, the search had turned to grief, and grief had turned to acceptance. But now she wasn't sure what to believe. She needed to be sure. Margaret spent the next few days buried in old files, pulling out every scrap of paperwork she had kept from Eleanor's case. Police reports, timelines, adoption records she had combed through in desperation years ago. She knew Alana had been adopted as a toddler. She had mentioned it over dinner. What were the odds? Margaret hesitated, fingers trembling as she reached for her phone. She could call Marcus, ask him more about Alana's past. But no, she needed proof first. She had spent her life as a woman of reason, a mother who had tried to believe in the rational when the world had given her every reason not to. But now, she was beginning to feel like she was standing at the edge of something far more fragile than logic. Something that could break all of them. The next time she saw Alana, the younger woman greeted her with a bright smile, warmth shining in her eyes. Margaret smiled back, masking the storm inside her. They were at a small cafe, one of Alana's favorites. She had invited Margaret to meet her for coffee, hoping to build their relationship further before the wedding. Margaret had accepted, knowing it was the perfect opportunity. As they talked, about wedding plans, about Marcus, about the chaos of their shared medical world, Margaret listened carefully, noting every small detail Alana shared about her childhood. "I never really wondered much about my biological parents," Alana admitted at one point, stirring the foam in her latte absent-mindedly. I think a part of me just figured, if they had wanted to find me, they would have. Margaret's stomach clenched, but she kept her voice even. That must have been difficult. Alana shrugged. My adoptive parents were wonderful. I had a good childhood, and by the time I was old enough to ask questions, there weren't really answers to find. Margaret nodded, forcing herself to breathe through the weight in her chest. It was now or never. Oh, she said, as if the thought had just occurred to her. Would you mind passing me a napkin, dear? Alana reached across the table, grabbing the napkin from the dispenser without hesitation. And Margaret saw it again. The birthmark. The exact same shape, the same placement. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear anything else. She needed more than that. She needed certainty. Forcing a smile, Margaret reached for her cup, taking a long sip before setting it down. Then, as Alana reached for her own, Margaret made her move. Her fingers wrapped subtly around the rim of Alana's coffee mug, careful, deliberate. When she pulled away, she did so with the napkin she had requested, discreetly wrapping it around the part of the mug Alana's lips had touched. It was done in an instant, unnoticed. A DNA sample. She had never done anything like this before. It felt like a betrayal, like stealing something that didn't belong to her. And yet, the weight of what was at stake left her with no other choice. The rest of their conversation passed in a blur. Margaret could barely focus, barely process anything Alana was saying. By the time they said their goodbyes, her fingers were curled tightly around the napkin-wrapped mug, her chest tight with something between hope and dread. That night, she sent the sample to a private DNA testing facility. And then, she waited. Each day felt longer than the last, stretching endlessly as Margaret tried to go about her routine. She spoke to Marcus as if nothing was wrong, congratulating him again on the wedding planning, asking about work, pretending everything was normal. But she wasn't normal. Nothing was normal. The moment the results arrived, she nearly dropped the envelope. Her hands trembled as she tore it open, her eyes scanning the page in frantic desperation. And then she saw it. The words blurred in front of her, but the truth was unmistakable. 99.9% match. Margaret's breath hitched, her body slumping into the chair as the paper slipped from her grasp. It was real. Alana wasn't just a woman Marcus loved. She was Eleanor. Her daughter was alive. Margaret let out a sob, covering her mouth with her hand as tears spilled down her cheeks. She had spent years mourning, living with a grief that had hollowed her out from the inside. But Eleanor hadn't been taken by death. She had been taken by someone else. Someone who had stolen her away and erased her past, giving her a new life under a different name. And now she was here, flesh and blood, standing at the precipice of a truth that would change everything. Marcus. Oh, God. Margaret's stomach twisted violently. He was in love with her, and he had no idea. Margaret sat frozen, the DNA report clutched in her trembling hands. The weight of the truth was suffocating, pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. She had spent years grieving, years convincing herself that Eleanor was gone, that her little girl had vanished into nothing. But she hadn't. She had been here all along, living, growing, falling in love with the man who was never supposed to be her brother. A part of her wanted to feel relief. Her daughter was alive. Eleanor, Alana, had survived, had built a life for herself, had become an extraordinary woman. But that relief was drowned out by something far more urgent, far more terrifying. Marcus. Her son, the boy she had raised, the man she had watched fall in love so deeply that for the first time, he seemed truly whole. He had found happiness with Alana, had chosen her as his future, and now Margaret had to take it all away. She wasn't sure how long she sat there, her body stiff and unmoving, staring at the same lines of text over and over again. The sun had set by the time she finally stood, her limbs feeling heavier than they had in years. She couldn't do this over the phone. This wasn't something she could drop into casual conversation. No, this was a truth that would shatter everything. She needed to see him. Marcus answered on the second ring. "Hey, Mom." His voice was warm, easy. It only made Margaret's stomach twist harder. "Can you come over?" Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, one she knew he would pick up on. There was a brief pause. "Is everything okay?" "I just need to talk to you," she said, softer this time. Another pause, then, "I'll be there in 20. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cup of tea in front of her, untouched. She had been drinking tea since she was a teenager, yet tonight she couldn't bring herself to swallow a single sip. When Marcus finally arrived, she barely had the strength to look at him. He kissed her cheek as he always did, setting his keys on the counter before settling across from her. "What's going on?" he asked. Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it again. How did she say this? How did she tell him that the woman he loved wasn't who she thought she was? She took a breath, gripping the edge of the table to steady herself. "It's about Alana." Marcus tensed slightly, his expression shifting. "What about her?" Margaret forced herself to meet his eyes. "I need you to listen to me, and I need you to not interrupt. This isn't easy for me to say." Marcus frowned, but nodded. "Okay." She exhaled slowly. "I did something. I know I shouldn't have, but I needed to know. And now that I do, I can't keep it from you." Marcus's brow furrowed. "Mom, what?" "I ran a DNA test on Alana." The words landed like a hammer in the space between them. Silence stretched long and thin, the air thick with something unspoken. Marcus blinked at her, confusion flickering across his face, then a shadow of something else, something darker. "What?" His voice was low, almost disbelieving. Margaret's throat tightened. I had to be sure." Marcus sat back, his jaw tightening. "Be sure of what?" Margaret swallowed. There was no turning back now. "Alana isn't just anyone. She's—" Her voice wavered. "She's Eleanor." Marcus didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't speak. His face was unreadable, his body unnaturally still, like a man who had just stepped into a world that no longer made sense. Margaret pressed forward, knowing the longer she dragged it out, the worse it would be. "She's my daughter," she whispered. "Your sister." Something cracked in his expression. A small thing, barely noticeable, but Margaret saw it. The slight shift in his jaw, the flicker in his eyes, the way his fingers curled against the tabletop as if trying to ground himself. Then he let out a breath, shaking his head, a humorless laugh escaping him. "No," he said simply. "Marcus, no." His voice was sharp now, edged with something dangerous. "That's not possible." Margaret slid the DNA report across the table. "It's right here." Marcus didn't touch it. He didn't even look at it. He just stared at her, as if waiting for the moment she would take it all back. When she didn't, something inside him shattered. He shoved back from the table, standing so abruptly that his chair scraped against the floor. "No," he said again, but this time it wasn't a denial. It was desperation. This isn't real. It can't be." Margaret felt her own heart breaking as she watched the son she had raised, the man who had always prided himself on control, fall apart in front of her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't want this to be true." Marcus dragged a hand through his hair, pacing the length of the kitchen like a man searching for an escape that didn't exist. "She's not my sister," he said, as if saying it enough times would make it true. "We're not—" He cut himself off, shaking his head violently. Margaret stood, reaching for him, but he pulled back as if her touch would burn him. "I love her," he said, voice hoarse. "I was going to marry her." Margaret's throat tightened. "I know." "She's not my sister," he said again, this time almost pleading. Margaret wished she could tell him what he wanted to hear, that this was all a mistake, that he could go back to the life he had before this moment. But she couldn't. "I need to see her." Marcus's voice was unsteady. Margaret hesitated. "Marcus, I need to see her," he repeated, already grabbing his keys. Margaret didn't try to stop him. There was nothing she could say that would ease the pain of what he was about to do. As she watched him walk out the door, her heart ached in a way it hadn't in decades. She had spent years mourning a daughter she thought was dead, and now she had to mourn the life her son had lost. Marcus drove through the darkened streets of Boston, his grip on the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. His pulse hammered in his ears, drowning out everything else: the hum of the engine, the quiet shuffle of pedestrians on the sidewalks, even the distant wail of a siren somewhere in the city. His mother's words still echoed in his mind. "Alana is Eleanor. She's my daughter. Your sister." No, it wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. And yet, the truth sat in the passenger seat beside him, invisible but suffocating. The DNA report, the birthmark, the eerie familiarity that had been there from the very beginning, lurking beneath the surface of their connection. He had to see her. He had to tell her, no, ask her. Because there had to be an explanation. Some flaw in the logic that he hadn't seen yet, some missing piece that would make all of this go away. By the time he pulled up outside Alana's apartment, his breath was shallow, his limbs cold. The street was quiet, the only movement coming from the occasional flicker of lights in nearby windows. He didn't hesitate. He climbed out of the car, walked up the front steps, and knocked. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then the door opened. Alana stood there, dressed in an oversized sweater and leggings, her dark curls falling loose over her shoulders. She smiled at first, warm, familiar, until she saw his face. "Marcus?" Her smile faltered, replaced by concern. "What's wrong?" He opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. He had rehearsed this moment during the drive, convinced himself he would find the right way to say it, but now that he was standing in front of her, it felt impossible. Because how did you tell the woman you loved that she was your sister? "Can I come in?" he finally managed. Alana stepped aside without hesitation, closing the door behind him. The apartment smelled like chamomile and vanilla, a comforting scent he had grown to associate with her. But tonight, there was no comfort. He stood in the center of her living room, staring at her, searching her face for some sign that she already knew, that this wasn't news, that she had been hiding something. She wasn't. She was just Alana, the woman he had planned to spend the rest of his life with. The woman who now had no idea that everything was about to shatter. "You're scaring me," she said softly. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, his breath coming out unsteady. "I don't know how to say this." She took a cautious step closer. "Say what?" He swallowed hard. "My mom, she—" He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "She ran a DNA test." Alana blinked. "A DNA test?" Marcus nodded, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "On you." Silence. Then the faintest crease formed between her brows. Why would she do that? Marcus hesitated, his throat tightening. "Because she thought you looked familiar? Because she saw your birthmark and remembered." His voice was barely above a whisper now. "Because she had a daughter once?" Something shifted in Alana's expression, a slow unraveling, like a thread being pulled from the fabric of her reality. "What are you saying?" Marcus took a breath, his chest aching with the weight of what he was about to say. The DNA test came back positive. Alana didn't react at first. She just stood there, perfectly still, as if her body hadn't quite caught up to the meaning of the words. Then, slowly, she shook her head. "No, Alana. No." Her voice was sharper this time, laced with something between disbelief and anger. She let out a short, breathless laugh. "That's ridiculous. It's not possible." Marcus felt something crack inside him. "I wish it wasn't." Alana pressed a hand to her temple, her breathing uneven. "This has to be a mistake. It has to be. There's no way." "She disappeared when she was 3. His voice was tight, strained. "You were adopted when you were a toddler. You don't remember where you came from." Alana's jaw clenched. "Lots of kids are adopted young." Marcus took a step closer, desperation creeping into his tone. "It's not just that. It's the birthmark, the timeline, the fact that no one ever found Eleanor Quinn after she went missing." Alana's hands curled into fists. "Stop calling me that." Marcus swallowed, his eyes burning. "I don't want this to be real, Alana." His voice broke slightly. "I don't." Her expression twisted, her eyes searching his for something, anything, that would tell her this was some cruel mistake. But there was nothing. She turned away from him, gripping the back of the couch like she needed something solid to hold on to. I don't." Her voice was hoarse. "I don't know who I am anymore." Marcus closed his eyes, the weight of her words sinking into him. Neither did he. He had spent his whole life knowing exactly who he was. He was Marcus Hale, a surgeon, a son, a man who had finally found love in the midst of a life ruled by logic. Now, he didn't know what he was. Alana let out a shaky breath. I need to think." Marcus hesitated, then nodded, his own voice hollow. "Me too." Neither of them moved. For a brief moment, he considered reaching for her, pulling her into his arms the way he always did when things felt unbearable. But he couldn't. Not anymore. Without another word, he turned and walked out the door. Alana sat in her apartment long after Marcus had gone, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if that alone could hold her together. Her mind raced, fragments of memory and reality colliding in a violent storm. It's not true. It can't be true. But the way Marcus had looked at her, the devastation in his eyes, the sheer certainty in his voice, told her otherwise. The world felt different now, unstable. Nothing had changed physically. The furniture was still in its place. The lights still cast a golden glow over the walls. The scent of chamomile tea still lingered in the air. But it was as if the very foundation of her life had cracked beneath her feet, and she was now standing at the edge of something terrifyingly unfamiliar. Who am I? The question looped in her head over and over, like a haunting melody she couldn't silence. She had always thought she knew. She had been Alana Porter, an accomplished doctor, a woman with a strong mind, a steady hand, a clear path. She had never questioned where she came from, never dug too deeply into the past. Her adoptive parents had given her a good life, a loving home, and yet, in a single evening, all of that had unraveled. She wasn't just Alana. She was someone else entirely. She was Eleanor Quinn. The name felt foreign in her mind, like a ghost of another life pressing against the edges of her consciousness. She didn't remember it. Didn't remember the mother who had mourned her, the home she had been stolen from, the life she had lost before she even understood what it meant to have one. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, the screen lighting up with a name that made her heart clench. Margaret Hale. She let it ring. She wasn't ready. Instead, she curled up tighter, pressing her forehead against her knees. The air in the room felt too thick, suffocating. The realization hit her with renewed force. I was going to marry my brother. The thought made her stomach churn violently. All those moments, every kiss, every whispered confession, every dream of a shared future. They had been built on a lie neither of them had known. And now, she and Marcus were standing on opposite sides of something they could never cross. A sob tore from her throat before she could stop it, her entire body trembling under the weight of it all. She didn't know how long she sat there before exhaustion finally pulled her under. Morning came too quickly. Alana woke to sunlight filtering through the blinds, but it did nothing to warm the cold pit in her stomach. She moved on autopilot, showering, dressing, forcing herself to go through the motions of normalcy. But nothing about today was normal. Her hands shook as she buttoned her blouse, as she poured herself a cup of coffee she didn't drink, as she stood in front of the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Her phone buzzed again. This time she forced herself to pick it up. "Hello?" Her voice was hoarse. There was silence on the other end for a moment, then Margaret's voice, careful, measured. "Alana?" A pause. "Or?" "Eleanor." Alana flinched at the name. "I don't know who that is." Margaret's exhale was soft, almost pained. "She's my daughter." Alana swallowed. "I don't remember her." "I know." Margaret's voice wavered, but there was something steady beneath it. "But that doesn't change what's true." Alana let her eyes drift to the window, to the city moving outside, oblivious to the storm raging within her. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Margaret hesitated. "Come see me." Alana stiffened. "Please," Margaret said gently. "I know this is overwhelming. I know you don't owe me anything. But you deserve answers, and I think you need them." Alana closed her eyes, her pulse hammering in her throat. "Do I?" She wanted to say no, wanted to run, wanted to pretend none of this had ever happened. But instead she whispered, "Okay." Margaret's house was exactly as she remembered it. Warm, well-kept, every detail carefully placed. But now, stepping inside, it felt different. Because now she knew. Margaret was already waiting in the living room when Alana walked in, standing near the fireplace, her hands clasped in front of her as if she wasn't sure what to do with them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Margaret smiled, a small, tentative thing, fragile in the way only a mother's hope could be. "Would you like some tea?" Alana almost laughed at how absurd the question felt in the middle of everything, but instead she nodded. "Yeah, I think I would." She followed Margaret into the kitchen, watching as she moved with practiced ease, setting out 2 cups, pouring steaming water over the tea leaves. It was such a normal, everyday thing, yet it felt so profoundly intimate that Alana had to look away. When they sat at the table, neither of them touched their cups. Margaret was the first to speak. "I don't know where to start." Alana let out a breath. "I don't either." Another silence. Then, Margaret reached across the table, hesitating for just a second before placing a small wooden box in front of Alana. Inside there were photographs. Alana stared at them, her hands motionless in her lap. She knew what they were before she even looked. "Go ahead," Margaret urged softly. Alana forced herself to pick one up. A little girl, no older than 3, beaming at the camera with wild curls and wide, mischievous eyes. She felt her breath hitch. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through them. Birthday parties. Christmas mornings. A tiny hand clutching Margaret's. A home that had once been hers, even if she had no memory of it. "I thought I lost you forever," Margaret whispered. Alana set the pictures down, her chest so tight she could barely breathe. "I don't know how to be this person," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's eyes softened. "I don't expect you to be anyone but who you are." Alana swallowed, looking away. "Who I am doesn't even make sense anymore." Margaret reached for her hand, and this time, Alana didn't pull away. "I don't have all the answers," Margaret said gently, "but I do know this. You are not lost. You never were. And no matter what happens next, you will never have to go through this alone." Alana blinked back the tears burning her eyes. For the first time in days, she didn't feel like she was drowning. She still didn't know who she was. But maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to find out. Alana sat in her apartment with a stack of papers spread across the coffee table, her fingers curled around a cup of cold tea. The documents stared back at her. Old police reports, adoption records, notes she had scribbled in frantic handwriting over the last few days. Every piece of information she had managed to gather pointed to one conclusion. She had been taken, not abandoned, not lost. Taken. She pressed her fingers to her temples, exhaling slowly, as if she could physically force the nausea from her body. It was one thing to discover that her entire life had been built on a lie, that the people she thought were her parents had been strangers, but it was something else entirely to realize that her existence had been stolen. Her identity, her childhood, her very name ripped away without her ever knowing. Her adoptive parents had never known the truth, she was certain of that. They had loved her, raised her, given her everything they could, but the person who had placed her in their arms had been a fraud. A woman with no claim to her, no right to take her from the life she had been meant to live. Margaret had told her the details of her disappearance, how she had vanished in a crowded park, how there had been no witnesses, no ransom, no trace. But now, with all the pieces laid out before her, Alana knew one thing with absolute certainty. Someone had taken her and then erased every trace of her past. And whoever had done it had gotten away with it. She leaned back on the couch, staring at the ceiling, the weight of it all pressing down on her chest. Who had taken her? And why? The police had given up years ago. There were no leads, no suspects, just a void where her past should have been. But Alana wasn't a child anymore, and she wasn't going to let the past stay buried. The next morning, she drove across town to the only person who might have answers. Detective Frank Calloway had been retired for over a decade, but his name had been on every report from her case. If there was anyone left who remembered what had happened, it was him. She found him in a small house on the outskirts of the city, a place that looked untouched by time. The door creaked open before she could knock twice, revealing a man in his 70s, his eyes sharp despite the lines of age that marked his face. "Dr. Porter?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Or should I say, Eleanor Quinn?" Alana's breath hitched. Calloway studied her for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in." She followed him into a cluttered living room, where the walls were lined with old case files and yellowed newspapers. It was like stepping into the past. "You knew," she said finally, watching as he lowered himself into an armchair with a tired grunt. "I suspect it," Calloway admitted. "Heard about you on the news a few times. Always thought you looked familiar." Alana sat on the edge of the couch, her hands curled together in her lap. "Why wasn't I ever found?" Calloway sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Because whoever took you was damn good at covering their tracks." Alana stiffened. "What do you mean?" The old detective reached for a folder on the coffee table, pulling out a worn photograph. He handed it to her, and she felt her breath catch in her throat. A woman stared back at her, sharp eyes, a thin mouth, hair pulled back into a severe bun. "This," Calloway said, "is the woman we think took you." Alana's grip tightened on the edges of the photograph. "Who is she?" Calloway leaned forward. Her name was Celia Monroe. Worked as a social worker back in the day, had a clean record, on paper at least, but we always suspected she was involved in a few illegal adoptions. Alana's stomach twisted. "Illegal adoptions?" Calloway nodded. "Babies, toddlers, young kids. Ones who wouldn't remember where they came from. She placed them with families who either couldn't adopt legally or didn't ask too many questions. The system was easier to manipulate back then. Less oversight." Alana felt like the air had been knocked from her lungs. "So, she sold me." Calloway's expression darkened. "We don't know for sure. By the time we started looking into her, she had disappeared, vanished without a trace, just like you." Alana swallowed hard, her pulse hammering. "She must have panicked," Calloway continued, "realized people were getting too close, so she got rid of you, placed you with an unsuspecting family, and ran." Alana stared at the photograph, her mind spinning. All these years she had believed she was unwanted, that her real parents had either abandoned her or been unable to find her. But the truth was far more horrifying. She hadn't been lost. She had been taken, and then she had been discarded. Her fingers curled around the photograph, her chest tight with something she couldn't quite name. Anger. Grief. A hollow, aching rage at the woman who had stolen her past, and then vanished like smoke. "What happened to her?" Alana asked, her voice raw. Calloway shook his head. "No one knows. Maybe she's dead. Maybe she's still out there. Either way, she got away with it. Alana exhaled shakily, setting the photograph back on the table. So, that's it, she said bitterly. She gets away with it, and I just live with it. Calloway studied her for a long moment. I wish I had better answers for you, kid. But sometimes all we get is the truth. No justice, no closure. Just the truth. Alana closed her eyes. She had spent her whole life chasing certainty, seeking answers, building a career around the idea that if you just knew enough, you could fix anything. But this wasn't something she could fix. It was just something she had to live with. That night, Alana sat in her apartment, staring out at the city lights, the detective's words still ringing in her ears. There would be no justice, no perfect resolution. She couldn't change the past. But maybe she could choose what to do with the future. Her phone vibrated beside her. She picked it up, her heart tightening when she saw the name. Marcus. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the screen. Then, before she could stop herself, she answered. A long silence stretched between them before he finally spoke. I miss you. Her throat tightened. I miss you too. Another silence, a heavier one. I don't know how to do this, Marcus admitted. His voice was raw, exhausted. Neither do I. The words hung between them, fragile and unspoken. They weren't siblings in the way that mattered. They had no shared childhood, no memories of growing up together. But the truth still stood between them, an immovable wall. They weren't meant to be together. And no amount of love could change that. I think, Marcus exhaled, I think I need time. Alana closed her eyes, forcing herself to swallow the lump in her throat. Okay, she whispered. A pause. Then, so softly she almost didn't hear it, I love you. A tear slipped down her cheek. I love you too. The line went dead. Alana stared at the screen, her heart aching. She had found the truth, and in doing so, she had lost the one thing that had ever truly felt like home. The weeks after Marcus's call passed in a strange, numbing blur. Alana threw herself into work, taking extra shifts at the hospital, burying herself in research, in surgeries, in anything that kept her mind from lingering too long on what she had lost. The truth of her past had cracked her life wide open, and now she was left sifting through the wreckage, trying to find something, anything, solid to hold on to. She hadn't seen Marcus since that night, hadn't called him, hadn't texted. He had asked for time, and she had given it to him, even though every day without him felt like walking through a world drained of color. Margaret checked in frequently, leaving voicemails, sending messages, gentle, patient reminders that she was still there, still waiting. Alana never responded, though she read every text, listened to every message. She didn't know why she was avoiding her. Maybe because she wasn't ready to accept what Margaret represented. Family. That word had always been simple before. It had been her adoptive parents, the people who had raised her, who had shaped her into the woman she was. But now, family felt like a shifting, uncertain thing. She had spent her whole life wondering, in quiet, fleeting moments, about the people who had given her up. Had they loved her? Had they looked for her? Had she been wanted? And now she knew. She had been wanted, desperately. And she had been stolen. That knowledge should have filled the hollow space inside her. But instead it left her more lost than ever. One evening, after another long shift, she found herself standing outside Margaret's house. She hadn't planned to come, hadn't thought about it at all. One moment she was leaving the hospital, and the next she was here, staring at the familiar door, heart pounding. Before she could second-guess herself, the door opened. Margaret stood there, her face lined with exhaustion, her eyes widening in surprise. "Alana," she breathed. Alana swallowed hard. She hesitated. "I don't know why I came." Margaret's lips trembled into a soft smile. "Come in anyway." She stepped aside, and Alana hesitated only a second before walking inside. The house was warm, inviting. There was something deeply familiar about it, something that sent a shiver through her, as if her bones remembered what her mind could not. Margaret led her to the living room, where a fire crackled softly in the hearth. They sat across from each other, the space between them filled with everything left unsaid. Finally, Alana spoke. "I don't know how to do this." Margaret's smile was small, understanding. "Neither do I." They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Margaret stood, walking over to a cabinet near the bookshelf. She pulled out a small wooden box, the same one Alana had seen before. She set it on the table between them. Alana's fingers trembled as she reached for it. Inside were more photographs, small trinkets, a tiny silver bracelet, a lock of baby hair, preserved in an envelope, faded birthday cards with clumsy handwriting, and in the middle of it all a worn stuffed rabbit with one missing eye. Alana inhaled sharply. A memory flickered, faint, distant, just a whisper of something long buried. A tiny hand clutching soft fabric. Warm, soothing. "Agent, Ellie, sweetheart, don't forget your bunny." She jerked back, her breath catching in her throat. Margaret was watching her carefully. "It was yours," she said softly. Alana swallowed hard, running a finger along the fabric, the weight of it suddenly unbearable. She had spent years thinking she had no past, that she had simply appeared one day, a blank slate. But she had belonged somewhere. She had been someone before Alana Porter ever existed. No harm, difficulty. I'm not hurt. I'm badly hurt. I'm up, Aid." Margaret's expression was gentle but firm. "You don't have to be. You're still you." Alana let out a shaky breath. "I don't know who that is anymore." Margaret reached out, covering Alana's hand with her own. "We'll figure it out," she said softly. Alana's throat tightened. For the first time in weeks, she let herself believe it might be true. The wedding was canceled quietly. No announcement, no dramatic explanation. Marcus and Alana simply told their friends and colleagues that they had decided to go their separate ways. There were whispers, of course, speculation. Some assumed they had grown apart. Others thought there had been a fight, an irreconcilable difference. Only 3 people knew the truth. And for now, that was how it had to stay. Marcus had left the country for a fellowship program. Alana hadn't spoken to him since that last phone call. She thought about him constantly, but she knew he needed space. And maybe, so did she. She focused on rebuilding, on grounding herself in the life she did have, instead of the one she had lost. She spoke to Margaret more often. At first, their conversations were hesitant, careful, but slowly, painfully, something real began to form between them. They didn't talk about the wedding, or Marcus, or the weight of everything that had changed. Instead, they talked about little things, recipes, books, childhood memories that Alana didn't remember but listened to anyway, as if absorbing them might somehow make them hers. Margaret shared stories about Eleanor, about the daughter she had lost, and Alana listened, trying to picture herself in a past she couldn't recall. At first it was uncomfortable, unfamiliar, but over time it became something else. It became home. Months passed. The pain dulled, but never disappeared. Alana learned to live with it, to accept the reality she had been given. She still woke up some nights thinking she was in another life, one where Marcus was still hers, where Margaret was just his mother, where everything was simple. But the dreams always faded, leaving her in the quiet truth of what was. One afternoon, as she sat in a coffee shop near the hospital, her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen, expecting another message from a colleague, another reminder for a meeting. But it wasn't. It was Marcus. Her heart clenched. She hesitated. Then, before she could stop herself, she swiped the screen and lifted the phone to her ear. There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then, he spoke. "Hey." His voice was familiar, cautious. Alana swallowed hard. "Hey." A pause. Neither of them knew how to begin. Then Marcus exhaled, and when he spoke again, there was something softer in his voice. "I miss you." Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. "I miss you too." Another silence. "I don't know what this means," Marcus admitted. I wanted to hear your voice." Alana closed her eyes. "Me too." They didn't make promises. They didn't try to rewrite fate. But for the first time in a long time, Alana felt like she could breathe again. Life had taken them down a path they had never expected, one filled with loss and heartbreak. But it had also given them something else, a truth they hadn't known they needed, a family they hadn't known they had, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. Sometimes, life takes us down paths we never expected, revealing truths that shake the very foundation of who we are. But as painful as those revelations may be, they also give us something invaluable, the chance to redefine ourselves, to choose how we move forward. This story is a reminder that the past may shape us, but it does not have to define us. Love is complicated, family is more than blood, and sometimes the hardest choices lead to the deepest healing. Even in loss, even in heartbreak, there is always a way forward. What did this story mean to you? Have you ever experienced a moment that changed everything you thought you knew? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another incredible journey. More stories are coming, and we can't wait to share them with you. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay curious, stay open, and always embrace the truth.